Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Widow, Lid to Everyone, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown's Shocking Widow Secret. The room was silent, the kind of silence that only comes after a scream has been swallowed whole. Father Brown stood over the body of the businessman, his heart pounding in his chest. The widow, her face pale and cold, was the last to speak. "He was everything to me," she had whispered, but Father Brown's keen eyes didn't miss the flicker of something else behind her eyes, something that felt darker than grief. It was a secret, one that she would kill to protect. The mystery was as simple as it was profound. A man dead in his prime, found in his study with no signs of a struggle. The widow stood by his side, distraught, yet something about her composure didn't match the horror of the situation. The police had declared it a natural death, a heart attack, too quick, too clean. But Father Brown knew better. He felt it in his bones. There was something wrong about the way the widow looked at the body, like she was seeing someone else. Someone whose death wasn't her fault, but was somehow her responsibility. Father Brown knew he was walking into a web of lies, but it was the kind of web that didn't look like a trap at first glance. He had to tread carefully, for this wasn't just a case of uncovering a crime, it was a case of unmasking the very nature of truth itself. Every lead, every question he asked seemed to twist around and lead him right back to the woman in mourning, whose face now appeared strangely serene. As Father Brown spoke with the housemaids, the gardeners, and the family attorney, his suspicions only deepened. No one seemed to know anything, yet everyone had a strange, almost rehearsed way of describing the widow's behavior. No one saw her leave the room the night of the businessman's death. No one could remember what she was doing before the doctor arrived. The more he dug, the more the answers felt like they were just out of reach, like a puzzle where the pieces had been deliberately scattered to confuse him. And then came the breakthrough. It wasn't a fact, but a feeling, a sense that something pivotal had been overlooked. Father Brown began to notice the subtle changes in the widow's story. First, it was the mention of her husband's business dealings, how she always seemed to have just a little more knowledge than a grieving spouse should. She spoke of investments that were far too intricate for a widow to grasp without a business partner's help. And why had no one noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, from sadness to something else? Was it relief? Could it be that the widow was hiding something more sinister than just a heart attack? Father Brown's mind worked at a maddening speed, piecing together details that should not have been connected. The widow had been seen with a man, the business partner who had mysteriously disappeared weeks before the death. Father Brown could feel the weight of this revelation sink into him. What was the connection between the widow and this man? Was the death truly an accident, or was it something more calculated? He needed answers, but he also knew that every answer would only open the door to even darker questions. Could he really trust what was happening in front of him? Then, just when Father Brown thought he had finally cracked the case, something more terrifying emerged. The widow had a confession to make. She pulled Father Brown aside, her voice trembling, but When she spoke, it wasn't the grief-stricken confession of a woman who had just lost her husband. "I didn't kill him, Father, but I did something worse," she said, her eyes suddenly full of a cold, calculating light. "I let him die because I knew it was coming. I knew it, Father, and I waited." The room seemed to spin around Father Brown as the chilling truth clawed its way into his mind. Let him die. Did she mean that she had known something that could have saved him, but chose to remain silent? What was it that she had known? What dark part of the businessman's life had she been involved in? Father Brown was no longer sure what he could believe. His thoughts spiraled out of control. He needed to confront her, to understand the full extent of her knowledge, but every time he tried to dig deeper, the walls of her story seemed to grow higher. He was now questioning everything, from the nature of the man's death to the true motives of the woman who had claimed to be his grieving widow. The deeper he went, the more tangled the web became. Father Brown knew that he was being led into a trap carefully woven by someone who understood the power of silence and the weight of secrets. He stared at the widow, at her carefully constructed face of grief. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the storm of doubt raging inside him. The widow's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't worried. "You'll never know, Father. Not the way you think." The last words lingered in the air as Father Brown stared at her. He had thought he knew the truth, but now, after hearing her confession, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. The widow had been playing a game far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But was it just a game to her? Or was there something even darker behind her calm demeanor? The truth was too elusive, slipping through Father Brown's fingers just when he thought he had it. The mystery was no longer about uncovering the dead man's secrets. It was about understanding the terrifying motivations of the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Father Brown was now more lost than ever, and the walls of the mystery closed in on him, pressing him into a corner where even he wasn't sure who he could trust. With a final, ominous glance at the widow, Father Brown turned away. "I know who did it," he said, but the words felt hollow, as though the truth itself had been consumed by the very shadows that hung around them. But the truth will never be told. And with that, the mystery deepened. The investigation was far from over. Father Brown was more certain than ever that this was only the beginning of something much darker than he could have ever predicted. Chapter 2. The Widow's Lies. Father Brown unveils. It was a lie so elaborate, so perfectly crafted, that Father Brown didn't even realize he'd been standing in its shadow for hours, staring at the widow's face, believing every word. The widow's grief had been as thin as paper, delicate but fragile, barely holding up against the weight of what Father Brown was about to discover. The quiet was broken by the shattering truth. Everything she had told him had been a lie. Father Brown had believed her at first, like everyone else had, a widow in mourning, her husband gone far too soon. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the deeper he dug into the woman's past, the more he realized that something was terribly off. It wasn't just her behavior, it was her story, her motives, her actions. Every piece of the puzzle he uncovered seemed to lead him in circles, each one more twisted than the last. The facade of innocence began to crumble, revealing a web of lies so intricate, so insidious, that it took everything Father Brown had to keep his mind from unraveling along with it. The first step was small, a discarded letter he found in the library, buried beneath old newspapers. The handwriting was unmistakable. He recognized it instantly as belonging to the widow's late husband. But it wasn't a letter of love or business. It was a letter of warning, a warning about her. The words were chilling. She has always known more than she lets on. I fear for what she is capable of. Father Brown had read it twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of it. Why had he never heard this before? Why had no one mentioned this letter? It didn't fit with the narrative everyone else had been telling him, and that, more than anything else, made Father Brown uneasy. Father Brown was a man who prided himself on his ability to listen to the silence between words, and in the silence that followed this discovery, he could hear the echoes of a much darker truth. The widow's perfect, practiced sorrow was beginning to feel like a performance he had been watching without realizing it. There had to be more. There was always more, and Father Brown was determined to find it. He decided to dig deeper into the widow's past. It wasn't enough to look at her present behavior. She was hiding something far bigger than a simple lie about her husband's death. There had to be a connection between the widow's past and the mysterious death of the businessman. The more Father Brown asked, the more people he spoke to, the more the widow's name seemed to appear in the strangest places. It wasn't just her late husband's cryptic letter. No, there were other things, other clues that pointed to a woman far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The widow's former housekeeper had worked for the family for nearly a decade and had left under mysterious circumstances only a year before the businessman's death. Father Brown managed to track her down, and though the woman was reluctant to speak at first, something in Father Brown's calm demeanor made her finally break. She was always in control, the housekeeper whispered, always one step ahead. She knew more than she ever let on. I left when I realized I couldn't trust her anymore. But the most shocking revelation came when Father Brown finally gained access to the businessman's personal files. Hidden among them was a series of transactions that appeared to involve the widow's family, transactions that had been deliberately hidden from the public eye. Money, accounts, properties, all tied to her in ways that suggested something far more sinister. Father Brown was piecing together a picture of a woman who had been manipulating events long before her husband's death. What had started as a simple investigation into a sudden death had now turned into something far more complicated, more dangerous. Father Brown was no longer sure where the truth ended and the lies began. But there was one thing he was certain of. The widow was not the grieving woman she had claimed to be. She had orchestrated everything. Her husband's death was only the beginning. The suspicion slowly turned to certainty, and as Father Brown pieced together the timeline of events, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary crime. The widow was not just hiding her husband's secrets, she was hiding her own, and each of those secrets seemed to be connected to a much larger, much darker plot. Father Brown's mind raced as he traced the connections, the financial deals, the strange relationships, and the growing number of potential suspects. Each new discovery only added to the complexity of the case. Father Brown was now facing a choice. He could confront the widow with what he knew, force her to reveal the truth, but he knew she would be ready. She was always ready. He could feel it in the air, that sense of impending danger. She was one step ahead, and the game was no longer about finding the murderer. It was about surviving, long enough to expose the truth. As Father Brown prepared for the next phase of his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Someone who knew exactly what he was uncovering. Someone who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But who could it be? Was it the widow herself? Or was it someone else, hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings? The first big suspect began to emerge. An old business partner of the deceased, a man who had disappeared without a trace in the weeks leading up to the businessman's death. His name had been mentioned in the letters Father Brown had found, and his connections to the widow were starting to look more than coincidental. This man had been in a position of power, someone who could easily manipulate events, control information, and keep the truth hidden. Father Brown's instincts told him that this was the person he had been searching for, but there was one thing that still troubled him. Why had no one thought to investigate this man before? Just when Father Brown thought he had everything figured out, a new piece of evidence came to light, one that twisted everything he thought he knew. A letter from the widow, written just days before her husband's death, hinted at a secret that would change everything. She had been involved in something far darker, something that involved not just her late husband, but a network of people with far-reaching influence. Father Brown knew that this was no longer just about a murder. It was about exposing a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. And then, as if to deepen the mystery even further, Father Brown received an anonymous tip that completely changed the trajectory of the case. The tipster claimed to know the identity of the real killer, but the information came with a catch. If Father Brown pursued it, the consequences would be dire. The threat was subtle, but it was there, hanging over him like a dark cloud. The walls of suspicion were closing in on Father Brown. Every step he took seemed to lead him closer to a truth that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The widow's lies had been so carefully constructed, so meticulously planned, that even Father Brown wasn't sure if he could ever fully unravel them. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stop now. With the investigation reaching its boiling point, Father Brown knew he had to make a choice. Continue down this dark path, knowing that the truth would bring unimaginable consequences, or walk away, letting the lies continue to fester in the shadows. The next piece of the puzzle was within his grasp, but as he reached for it, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. And just as the final, shocking reveal was about to unfold, Father Brown found himself staring into the abyss of his own uncertainty. "I know who did it," he whispered to himself, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the weight of the truth he had uncovered. But the truth will never be told. And with that, Father Brown stepped into the darkness, knowing that the mystery was far from over, but too overwhelmed by the complexity of it to continue any further. The answers would have to wait. But for how long? Chapter 3. Father Brown reveals a hidden truth. The room fell silent as Father Brown placed the last piece of the puzzle into place, and for a moment it felt as though the world itself had stopped. He had uncovered something so shocking, so profound, that it shattered everything they thought they knew about the widow and the murder. In the quiet stillness that followed, Father Brown spoke only 4 words. "She's not who she seems." The widow, whom everyone had once pitied, was not just a grieving spouse. She wasn't simply the innocent woman whose husband had died too young. No, there was something far darker buried in her past, something that had remained hidden for far too long. Father Brown had spent weeks piecing together the fragments of this case, and now, as the final pieces clicked into place, he saw the terrifying truth for what it was. The murder, her husband's death, wasn't just a crime of passion. It was something far more calculated, a tragedy steeped in a labyrinth of lies, betrayal, and a secretive organization lurking in the shadows. Father Brown's instincts had been telling him that something didn't add up, that there was more to the widow than met the eye. The widow's perfect act of grief, her stoic composure, had never quite matched the level of devastation one would expect from a woman who had just lost the love of her life. The more Father Brown had looked into her past, the more inconsistencies he had uncovered. But it wasn't until he'd spoken with a former associate of the deceased, someone who had known both the widow and the late businessman, that the truth began to emerge. The businessman had been involved in something that went far beyond simple business dealings. He had been part of an underground network, a secretive group that had ties to powerful people across the country. Father Brown could feel the weight of the words as they echoed in his mind. The widow's involvement with this group had been kept under wraps, not just from the public, but from those closest to her as well. No one had suspected that she was not merely the wife of a wealthy businessman. She had been an integral part of something much darker. As Father Brown began to connect the dots, he realized that the widow's motivations were far more sinister than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about money or revenge, it was about power, and the death of her husband had been orchestrated to serve a purpose far greater than her grief. But what was the purpose? What had her husband known that had made him a target? Was it his connection to the secretive organization, or was it something else entirely? Father Brown's head swirled with questions, each one leading to another mystery, another piece of the puzzle that he could no longer ignore. The more Father Brown dug, the more the web of lies began to unravel. He discovered that the widow had been involved with the organization long before her husband's death. She had been playing a dangerous game, manipulating everyone around her to achieve her goals. The organization she was a part of wasn't just some group of businessmen or financiers. It was a secret society, one that had existed for decades, pulling strings behind the scenes, influencing politics, economics, and power structures. The widow had been a key player in this society, using her marriage to the businessman as a means of gaining access to resources, information, and influence. But Father Brown wasn't finished. He knew there had to be more, something that would explain why the widow had been so calm in the face of her husband's murder. She had known somehow that her husband's death was inevitable. He had been the one man standing in the way of the society's ultimate goal, and when he became a liability, she had acted. She had orchestrated his death, but it wasn't out of love or grief. It was out of necessity. The businessman's death had been a calculated move, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the organization's plans. As Father Brown pieced together the final moments of the businessman's life, he uncovered a shocking piece of evidence that would change everything. It was a letter, hidden in a drawer, tucked away behind a stack of old documents, that revealed the true extent of the widow's involvement in the organization. The letter was addressed to a man named Edmund Cole, a powerful figure within the society, and it spoke of a deal that had been struck between the widow and the organization. The letter outlined the terms of her husband's death, a death that was meant to be the first in a series of events that would ultimately lead to the widow's rise to power within the secret society. The widow had been playing a dangerous game all along, and Father Brown was beginning to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had been hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't just her husband who had been a pawn. It was the entire town, the entire community. Everyone had been unknowingly complicit in her plans. The murder was only the beginning of a much larger scheme, one that Father Brown was determined to expose, no matter the cost. But there was still one crucial clue missing. The widow had been too careful, too precise in her actions. She had covered her tracks well, leaving only faint traces for Father Brown to follow. The truth seemed just out of reach, like a shadow in the corner of his vision that he couldn't quite catch. Father Brown knew that he had to dig deeper to uncover the final piece of the puzzle that would tie everything together. As Father Brown prepared to confront the widow with the truth, he realized that he had underestimated her. She was more than just a grieving widow. She was a mastermind, a woman who had spent years plotting and scheming to gain control of a world that no one else could even see. Father Brown was no longer sure if he was hunting the murderer or if the murderer was hunting him. In the final moments before the confrontation, Father Brown found himself standing at a crossroads. The truth was within his grasp, but at what cost? He knew that exposing the widow's secrets would change everything, but the consequences could be catastrophic. The widow wasn't just guilty of murder. She was guilty of something far more dangerous. The widow's lies were the foundation of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that could destroy everything Father Brown had worked for. As Father Brown entered the widow's home, he could feel the tension in the air. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the widow knew it. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and Father Brown could see the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "I know who you are," Father Brown said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I know what you've done, and I know what you're capable of." The widow didn't flinch. She simply nodded, as if she had known this moment would come. "You think you know everything, Father, but there's still so much more you don't understand." Father Brown took a step forward, determined to finish what he had started. "Tell me the truth." Now the widow's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Father Brown saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of something more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The room fell silent, and Father Brown knew that the truth he had been chasing for so long was about to come crashing down upon him. But just as the widow opened her mouth to speak, the door swung open, and the final, unexpected twist of the mystery was revealed. Father Brown stood frozen, staring into the face of the one person he never expected to see, the person who held the last crucial clue, the person who held the key to everything. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, but even as the words left his lips, he realized that the truth, much like the widow's lies, would never be fully revealed. And with that, Father Brown turned away, knowing that the mystery would continue to haunt him, long after the widow's secrets had been buried. Chapter 4. The Deadly Clue. Father Brown finds. The moment. Father Brown picked up the small, seemingly insignificant scrap of paper. He knew the entire case had changed. It was just a piece of parchment, crumpled and discarded in the corner of a dusty room, but it held something much more dangerous, a deadly clue hidden in plain sight, waiting to expose a truth that no one wanted uncovered. What seemed like a trivial detail would soon send Father Brown down a path that no one could have predicted. The walls of the case began to close in, and with that single discovery, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. It had been days since Father Brown had started investigating the murder of the businessman, and every clue had only deepened the mystery. The widow, the seemingly innocent woman who had lost everything, remained a prime suspect, but Father Brown had begun to suspect that the truth was far more complex than anyone realized. He had uncovered dark secrets, a web of lies, and hidden alliances, but it all seemed to be leading to a dead end. Nothing made sense. The widow's alibi was airtight. The businessman's financial dealings were legitimate. There were no obvious enemies, no glaring motive. It was as if the entire crime had been orchestrated in the shadows, invisible to everyone except those who were meant to see it. Father Brown had always believed that the smallest detail could make the biggest difference, that the truth often lay in the most overlooked places. But he never imagined that the breakthrough would come from something so ordinary. The scrap of paper lay there, discarded among a pile of old newspapers, so easily missed by anyone else, but not Father Brown. He noticed it immediately, the way it was folded, its corners creased and stained. It wasn't just trash, it was something that had been deliberately hidden, left behind by someone who thought it would never be found. Father Brown unfolded the paper slowly, his fingers trembling with anticipation. What he found was a list of names. Some were crossed out, others circled, and a few had notes scribbled beside them in a hurried hand. The names weren't familiar to him at first, but as he read further, his heart sank. One name stood out above the rest: Edmund Cole, a name Father Brown had come across before in his investigation. Cole was a powerful figure within the secretive organization that the widow had been connected to, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the town. But why was his name here on a scrap of paper, hidden among these seemingly random names? Father Brown's mind raced. What had this list been for? Was it a record of people involved in the widow's conspiracy? Was Cole the mastermind behind the murder? Or was he just another pawn in a game much bigger than anyone realized? The list was a clue, but it was also a dead end. There was no explanation, no context, just names, dates, and cryptic notes. Father Brown knew that the answer was hidden somewhere in those lines, but he couldn't yet see it. He needed to find more. He needed to understand why this paper had been so carefully discarded, and why someone had gone to such lengths to keep it hidden. As Father Brown began to piece together the rest of the evidence, a disturbing realization dawned on him. Whoever had left this paper behind had been watching him, waiting for him to find it. Someone had known he would uncover the truth, and they had gone to great lengths to ensure that the clues would lead him in the wrong direction. But why? What was it that they were trying to hide? Father Brown's suspicion grew with every step he took. There was more to this murder than just a secretive organization. There was something far darker at play, something that reached into the very heart of the town itself. As he continued to examine the list, Father Brown discovered a connection between the names and the businessman's financial records. The widow's late husband had been involved in several shady transactions, but they were all tied to people on this list, people who had been involved in activities that were far from legal. The web of deceit was growing tighter, and Father Brown knew that he was on the brink of uncovering something that would change everything. But just as he was about to delve deeper into these new leads, something unexpected happened. Father Brown received an anonymous warning. The letter was simple, its message short and direct. Stay out of it, Father. You don't know what you're dealing with. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but Father Brown knew that it was serious. Whoever was behind this wanted him to stop digging, to turn away from the truth. The stakes had just been raised, and Father Brown knew that the danger was far closer than he had realized. The warning didn't deter Father Brown, it only fueled his determination. He had uncovered a deadly clue, one that was too important to ignore. But now, with the threat of danger hanging over him, the investigation had taken on a new sense of urgency. Father Brown couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The truth was within reach, but it was being guarded by forces far more powerful than he had anticipated. As Father Brown continued to follow the trail of names and connections, he discovered that the widow's involvement with the organization was far deeper than he had first thought. She wasn't just a member, she was a key player, someone who had orchestrated events from the shadows. The businessman's death wasn't a simple murder. It was part of a larger plan, a plan that had been set into motion long before Father Brown had ever entered the picture. But even as Father Brown pieced together these new revelations, something still didn't add up. He had the list, he had the connections, but there was still one crucial clue missing. Something that would tie everything together, something that would expose the true mastermind behind the murder. Father Brown knew that the answer was out there, but it was elusive, hidden beneath layers of deception and lies. And just as he was about to uncover the final piece of the puzzle, another shock hit him. A phone call, the voice on the other end cold and distant. "If you want to find out the truth, Father, you'll have to pay the price." The line went dead before Father Brown could respond, leaving him standing in the dark, more uncertain than ever before. The stakes had just become personal. With the danger closing in, Father Brown had to make a choice: continue his investigation, knowing that the truth could cost him everything, or walk away and let the lies remain buried forever. But Father Brown knew that he could never walk away from the truth, no matter the cost. The deadly clue was just the beginning, and Father Brown's journey into the heart of darkness had only just begun. But as he prepared to move forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. As Father Brown stood at the crossroads, with the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, one final question echoed in his mind. Who would stop at nothing to keep him from uncovering the full truth? And as the answer to that question loomed ever closer, Father Brown realized that the deadliest part of the mystery was yet to come. "I know who did it," Father Brown said quietly to himself, "but the truth, it may never be told." Chapter 5. Father Brown's dark revelation unfolds. The moment Father Brown unearthed the truth about the widow, his world shattered. He had believed he was getting closer to the heart of the mystery, that the veil of deceit was lifting, but what he found instead was a secret so dark, so buried, that it threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. As he stared at the evidence in his hands, his breath caught in his throat. The widow wasn't just guilty of a murder. She was hiding a secret so dangerous that it could bring down everyone involved, including Father Brown himself. What he was about to uncover would unravel the very fabric of the case, and the stakes had just risen higher than ever before. Father Brown had been digging deeper, trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle. The widow's lies had been so carefully constructed, so methodical, that he could barely see the cracks in her story. But there was something that didn't add up, something that gnawed at him relentlessly. It wasn't just the way she had orchestrated her husband's death, nor was it her strange calmness in the face of tragedy. It was something deeper, something far more insidious. Father Brown had learned over the years that sometimes the most dangerous secrets were the ones that had been buried for years, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. And now he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The widow had been hiding something, a secret from her past that no one could have imagined. Father Brown had uncovered it by accident, a seemingly inconsequential detail that led him to the discovery of a hidden room in the widow's mansion. It had been tucked away, unnoticed, hidden beneath layers of dust and forgotten memories. When Father Brown opened the door, he found something that made his stomach turn. Old photographs, faded letters, and documents that pointed to a life the widow had long since tried to forget. The documents were dated, some of them from as far back as 20 years ago. They chronicled a different woman, one who had been involved in a much darker world than anyone could have guessed. The widow had once been part of a criminal organization, an underground network that dealt in illegal arms, smuggled goods, and more. She had been more than just a participant. She had been a key player, someone whose influence had been felt across the continent. She had hidden her past well, but the evidence in this room was undeniable. Father Brown's mind raced as he absorbed the information. The woman he had been chasing for so long, the one who had seemed so innocent, so perfect in her grief, had been living a lie. She had been running from her past, burying it beneath layers of carefully crafted deception. But now, that past was catching up with her. Father Brown's instincts told him that the widow's involvement in this dark world wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of something far more dangerous, something that had led to her husband's death. But what was it? What was the motive behind this elaborate scheme? As Father Brown sifted through the photographs and documents, he realized that the widow's connection to the criminal organization was more than just professional. It was personal. There were images of her with men whose faces were now hauntingly familiar. Edmund Cole, the name that had cropped up time and again in the investigation, appeared in many of the photographs. But it wasn't just him. There were others, people Father Brown had never heard of, people whose names were linked to powerful figures in the underworld. The widow had been more than just a wife. She had been a key figure in this shadowy world. And when her husband had become a liability, she had made the decision to eliminate him. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still so much Father Brown didn't understand. Why had the widow chosen her husband as the target? Was he the one who had been threatening the organization? Had he known too much? Or was he just a pawn in a much larger game? The questions swirled in Father Brown's mind, each one more pressing than the last. But as he continued to dig deeper, one thing became clear. The widow wasn't just hiding a secret. She was running from a past that would destroy her if it ever came to light. Father Brown's discovery was the turning point in the investigation. What had once seemed like a simple murder, mystery had now become a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and danger. The deeper Father Brown went, the more he realized that the widow wasn't just a grieving spouse. She was a woman who had been living in the shadows for years, hiding a dark secret that no one could have guessed. The truth was more complicated, more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. But just as Father Brown was about to confront the widow with his findings, something unexpected happened. He was warned. A letter slipped under his door, the handwriting unmistakable. "Leave it alone, Father Brown. You're digging too deep. The truth will destroy you." The words sent a chill down Father Brown's spine. He had come too far to turn back now, but the threat was real. Whoever was behind this didn't want the truth to come out. The widow wasn't the only one with something to hide. And now, Father Brown was caught in a dangerous game where the stakes were higher than ever before. The letter was a warning, but it also pushed Father Brown forward. He knew that whoever was behind the threat was involved in the mystery, perhaps even the mastermind behind the entire plot. The widow was just a piece of the puzzle, a pawn in a game much bigger than anyone had realized. Father Brown had to find out who was really pulling the strings, who was behind the murder and the web of lies that had been carefully constructed around it. But the more he uncovered, the more dangerous the case became. The deeper Father Brown went, the more he realized that the truth could destroy everything. The widow's dark secret wasn't just about her own survival, it was about protecting a much larger conspiracy. If the truth came to light, it could bring down powerful figures, shake the very foundation of society. The stakes were no longer just about solving a murder. They were about uncovering a conspiracy that could change the world as they knew it. Father Brown had to decide whether he was willing to risk everything to expose the truth, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. As Father Brown prepared for the final confrontation, he knew that the widow would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. But there was something else he had discovered, something that made him question everything he thought he knew. The widow was not alone. There were others involved, people whose names had yet to surface, and they were watching him. They knew what he had uncovered, and they would do anything to ensure that the truth stayed buried. Father Brown's resolve was unwavering. He had come this far, and he couldn't stop now. But as he walked into the final confrontation, the weight of what he had learned bore down on him. The truth was within his grasp, but it was more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. As he stood before the widow, ready to expose her secrets, he realized that the truth was more complicated, more deadly than he had ever thought possible. The room fell silent, and Father Brown spoke, the words that would change everything. "I know what you've done. I know the secrets you've been hiding. But what I don't know, what no one knows, is how far you'll go to protect them." The widow's eyes darkened. "You don't understand, Father. You have no idea what you're dealing with." And just like that, the mystery deepened. Father Brown had uncovered the truth, but it was only the beginning. The real game was just starting, and the consequences would be far greater than anyone could have predicted. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth was now a weapon, one that could destroy everything. Father Brown had made his choice, but the cost was still unknown. The widow's secrets would remain hidden for now, but Father Brown was ready to uncover them, no matter the cost. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, his voice steady, "but the truth, it will never be told." And with that, Father Brown stepped into the unknown, knowing that the mystery was far from over, and the dark revelation he had uncovered would change everything. Chapter 6: The Widow's Deceit. Father Brown exposes. Father Brown stood there, the truth finally within his grasp, as the widow's carefully crafted web of deceit unraveled before him. The lies she had woven over the past few months, the story of grief, of innocence, of betrayal, was all a performance. And now, as the final piece fell into place, Father Brown realized that he had been played from the very beginning. The widow wasn't just a grieving woman seeking justice for her husband's death. No, she had been manipulating everyone from the start. What she had hidden from the world, what she had been hiding from him, was far darker and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As Father Brown carefully examined the last of the evidence, the stack of letters he had uncovered in the widow's hidden room, a chilling realization hit him. The widow had been in control of her husband's fate long before he had died. The pieces began to fall into place with terrifying precision. The perfect act of grief, the way she had so convincingly portrayed herself as the helpless widow, everything was part of a larger plan. The murder was not a crime of passion or an accident. It was calculated, premeditated, and expertly executed. The widow had orchestrated every detail, every moment leading up to her husband's death. But why? What was she truly after? Father Brown knew that this wasn't just about a simple murder mystery. The widow was playing a far more dangerous game, one with consequences that could reach far beyond her own life. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more it became clear. The widow's deceit was not an isolated act. She was not working alone. Someone else, someone with far greater power and influence, was pulling the strings, and the widow was merely a pawn in their game. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more tangled the web became. The businessman, who had once appeared to be an innocent victim, was revealed to be involved in far more than just business. Dealings. He had been a part of a network, a dark and secretive organization with connections that reached into the highest levels of power. Father Brown could feel the weight of the conspiracy closing in around him. The widow was merely the tip of the iceberg. The real truth, the one that had been hidden for so long, was far more complex and dangerous than he had anticipated. But just as Father Brown was about to reveal everything he had discovered, a new piece of the puzzle came to light, one that would change everything. It was a name that Father Brown had heard before, but hadn't thought much of until now. Edmund Cole, the powerful figure who had been involved in the widow's past, the one who had been connected to the businessman's dealings. But now, Father Brown realized that Cole was more than just an accomplice. He was the mastermind behind the entire operation, and the widow, despite all her deceit, had been working for him all along. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced the story together. The widow had been part of Cole's plan from the very beginning. She had married the businessman not out of love, but out of necessity. He had been the perfect cover for her true intentions. She had used him to gain access to the organization's secrets, to further her own position within the powerful network. And when the businessman became a liability, when he started asking too many questions, the widow had made sure he was silenced. His death had been orchestrated by her, but it had been Cole's plan all along. The widow had simply played her part, using her grief and her charm to keep everyone in the dark. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. The widow wasn't the only one with blood on her hands. The entire organization, the network of powerful figures who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, was at risk of being exposed. Father Brown knew that if he revealed the truth, it would bring down everything. But the question was, could he reveal the truth without becoming a target himself? Father Brown's mind was spinning, but he knew one thing for certain. The widow's deceit was only the beginning. As he sat in the quiet of his study, staring at the evidence before him, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond the widow, far beyond the businessman. The truth, the real truth, was far darker than anything he could have imagined. But there was still so much he didn't know, so many pieces missing from the puzzle. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, a new revelation came to light. Father Brown had been followed. Someone knew what he had uncovered. Someone had been watching him every step of the way, waiting for him to make his next move. The letter had been a warning, but this was something far more ominous. A shadow in the dark, a figure lurking just out of sight, always one step ahead. Father Brown could feel the weight of the danger pressing in on him. The stakes had never been higher. The widow's deceit had led him to the brink of discovery. But now, the game had changed. It was no longer just about the widow. It was about protecting the truth and staying alive long enough to reveal it. Father Brown had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, but now he could feel the walls closing in. The conspiracy was far larger than he had ever anticipated, and the widow's manipulation was just the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous game. He could no longer trust anyone. No one was who they claimed to be. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the truth was slipping away from him. It was a slippery slope, one that led deeper and deeper into a world of deceit, power, and manipulation. With each new piece of evidence, Father Brown's resolve hardened. He couldn't stop now. The truth was within his reach, but the cost of uncovering it was higher than he had ever imagined. The widow's deceit had been a carefully constructed lie, but the consequences of exposing it were more than just personal. They were dangerous. There were people in power who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. Father Brown knew that his life was now at risk. As Father Brown prepared for his next move, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he turned a corner, every time he uncovered a new clue, someone was always one step ahead. The web of deceit had grown so complex that Father Brown could no longer see where the truth ended and the lies began. The widow was just one part of the puzzle, but now Father Brown knew that he was in the middle of something far bigger, far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And just when he thought he was about to unravel the mystery, a new twist appeared. A phone call, a voice on the other end that he didn't recognize. "You're getting too close, Father Brown. Stop digging, or the consequences will be more than you can handle." The line went dead before Father Brown could respond, leaving him standing there in the silence, his heart racing. The danger was real, and the stakes were higher than ever before. Father Brown knew that he couldn't back down now. The widow's deceit had led him to a revelation that would change everything. But there was still one crucial piece of the puzzle missing, and as the danger closed in around him, Father Brown realized that the truth, no matter how dangerous, was the only thing worth fighting for. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, "but the truth will never be told." And with that, he stepped forward into the unknown, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. Chapter 7. Father Brown confronts a dangerous lie. The moment Father Brown stepped into the widow's study, he knew the truth would either destroy her or set him on a path from which there would be no return. The lies she had been hiding, the manipulations that had gone unnoticed by everyone around her. He was about to expose it all. But in doing so, he would risk everything: his career, his reputation, and his life. The air was thick with tension, and as he locked eyes with her, Father Brown could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had spent weeks unraveling the widow's carefully constructed web of deceit, and now, standing on the edge of this final confrontation, he could hear the ticking of the clock, counting down to a moment that would change everything. The widow's face was a mask of composure, her perfectly painted grief still clinging to her like a second skin. But Father Brown knew better now. He could see through the facade she had so carefully built. This was no longer just about a murder. This was about power, manipulation, and a secret that could bring down everyone involved. The widow was the key, but she was also the most dangerous piece of the puzzle. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more he realized that this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was part of a much larger conspiracy, one that reached into the darkest corners of society. Father Brown couldn't ignore the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching him. The walls were closing in, and every move he made seemed to have eyes on it. As he stared across the room at the widow, he could almost hear the whispers in the shadows, the threat of consequences for exposing what had been buried for so long. But despite the danger, Father Brown knew that he had no choice. The truth had to come out. It was the only way to stop this madness from spreading further, to stop the widow from using her lies to destroy innocent lives. "Do you know what I've found, madam?" Father Brown's voice was steady, but the words carried a weight that shook the widow's composure for a fleeting moment. He could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, the briefest hesitation before she regained control. "Do you know how deep your lies go? How far back they reach? Your manipulations weren't just about protecting yourself. They were about something far more dangerous." The widow didn't speak at first. She stood there, frozen in the moment, as if she were trying to process what Father Brown had just said. The silence between them stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. And then slowly, she smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you know everything, don't you, Father?" Her voice was cold, calculated. "But you don't. You have no idea what you're really dealing with." Father Brown's heart raced as he took a step forward. "I know enough to understand that the truth you've been hiding isn't just about a murdered husband. It's about a network, a conspiracy that you've been a part of for far longer than anyone could have guessed. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now the lies are catching up with you." The widow's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're a fool, Father. You think that just because you've found a few scraps of paper and whispers from the past, you've uncovered everything. You're wrong. You have no idea what's really at stake here. No idea how deep the roots of this go." Father Brown felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed that the widow's lies were the key, but now, standing before her, he realized just how much he still didn't understand. She wasn't just an accomplice to a murder. She was part of something far more complex, something that reached into the core of power, corruption, and deceit. He had thought that he could trust the evidence, the documents, and the photographs, but now, with the widow standing before him, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The deeper he dug, the more the truth seemed to slip through his fingers, like sand in the wind. There was someone else behind all of this, someone pulling the strings from the shadows. Father Brown's mind raced as he thought back to everything he had uncovered. The strange transactions, the cryptic letters, the names that kept reappearing. He had been following a trail, but it was leading him into a maze of lies that seemed impossible to navigate. The widow had been the face of this deception, but she wasn't the mastermind. There was someone else, someone far more dangerous. He turned his gaze back to the widow. "I know you didn't act alone. This isn't just about you. There are others involved, aren't there? You've been hiding behind this mask of grief, but the truth is, you've been working with others who share your secrets, and they don't want anyone to know what you've done." The widow's expression darkened, and Father Brown saw a flicker of something in her eyes. A flash of recognition, perhaps, or the realization that her carefully constructed world was starting to collapse around her. But she didn't back down. "You don't understand, Father. You're just a man of God. You think you can expose the truth, but you have no idea what you're up against. There are forces far more powerful than you could ever comprehend." Father Brown's pulse quickened. "Then tell me who's behind this. Tell me why your husband had to die. Tell me why you've been hiding these lies for so long." The widow's smile returned, but this time it was cold, calculating. "You think you can solve this, Father? You think you can expose everything with your little investigation? The truth is far more dangerous than you realize. If you keep going down this path, if you keep digging into things you shouldn't, you'll find yourself standing at the edge of a cliff, and when you fall, no one will be there to catch you." The warning hung in the air, heavy with menace. But Father Brown wasn't intimidated. He had come too far to stop now. The widow's deceit had been the first layer of the mystery. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the real truth was still hidden beneath the surface. The deeper he went, the more dangerous the case became. The widow was just one part of a much larger conspiracy, and now that he was so close to the truth, Father Brown couldn't back down. As he stood there facing the widow, Father Brown realized that he was no longer just investigating a murder. He was uncovering a world of corruption and manipulation, a world where the line between right and wrong blurred into nothingness. The widow was only a small piece of the puzzle, but she had been the key that unlocked the door to everything else. And just as he was about to push forward, a sudden noise interrupted the tension in the room. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Father Brown's heart skipped a beat. Someone else was here. Someone who had been listening, waiting. The door opened, and a shadowy figure stepped into the room. Father Brown turned, his pulse racing. The figure was tall, their face obscured by the dim lighting, but the sense of danger was immediate. Whoever this person was, they weren't here to help. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and Father Brown could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about exposing the widow's lies anymore. It was about surviving the truth and the consequences that came with it. "I know who did it," Father Brown muttered, his voice low but steady. "But the truth, it will never be told." The room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in. The figure in the doorway took a step forward, their presence heavy with intent. Father Brown knew that this was the moment. The truth, the final revelation, was within his grasp. But at what cost? Could he really expose everything, knowing the danger it would bring, or would he be forced to walk away, letting the darkness consume the truth forever? The figure stepped into the light, revealing their face, and with that, Father Brown realized that the truth was far more complicated and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Chapter 8. The Sinister Truth Father Brown Discovers. The moment Father Brown uncovered the letter, everything changed. It was a simple, crumpled piece of paper tucked into the back of an old ledger, but its contents were nothing short of explosive. The widow's carefully constructed world of lies was beginning to unravel, and with it, her carefully concealed past. The shock of what he found hit him like a cold wind, as if the truth had finally found a way to break through the layers of deception she had so skillfully built. It was a secret so dark, so sinister, that it changed everything. And now Father Brown had to decide whether to confront her with it, or whether doing so would tear the fragile world apart even further. Father Brown had been on the case for weeks, sifting through the widow's lies, trying to connect the dots between her grief-stricken performance and the cold, calculating manipulation he suspected lay beneath. He had uncovered much about her hidden life, her connection to the criminal organization, her husband's suspicious dealings, the secrets she had carefully guarded. But none of it prepared him for the truth he was about to discover. The widow wasn't just hiding her husband's murder. She was hiding something far more dangerous, something that, if exposed, could bring her entire world crashing down. The more Father Brown investigated, the more the widow's facade seemed to crack. Her lies had been clever, but there was always something just a little too perfect about her story. A widow who never shed a tear, who moved through her grief with mechanical precision. It didn't sit right with Father Brown. There had to be more, something buried beneath the surface, something she was hiding with everything she had. That's when he found it. The letter. It had been hidden in a drawer, wedged between two thick volumes of financial records. At first glance, it seemed like just another piece of forgotten paperwork, but as Father Brown read the letter, his heart sank. It was dated years before her husband's death, but the words were chilling. The letter wasn't just from the widow's past. It was a confession, one that revealed the true depth of her deceit. In the letter, the widow had made a deal, one that had far-reaching consequences. She had been promised wealth, power, and security in exchange for her involvement in a crime so heinous, so far beyond the ordinary, that it shocked even Father Brown. She had been a part of a dark conspiracy, a network of powerful people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And her husband had been involved in it too. What Father Brown had thought was a simple murder had now turned into something far more complex. The widow had been playing a game for far longer than anyone had realized. And now Father Brown could see the strings she had been pulling, the alliances she had forged, the manipulation that had led to her husband's death. Father Brown was no stranger to dark secrets, but the truth he had uncovered was unlike anything he had encountered before. The widow's past was a tangled web of betrayal, deception, and violence. She had been complicit in the organization's crimes, helping to cover up murders, laundering money, and manipulating those around her. Her husband had known too much, and when he had threatened to expose the truth, she had made sure he was silenced. But the letter didn't end there. As Father Brown read further, he discovered something even more shocking. Someone else had been involved in the conspiracy. Someone he had never expected. Edmund Cole. The name had come up before, but Father Brown hadn't yet understood the full extent of Cole's role in the widow's life. He was the one who had been pulling the strings, the one who had made the deal with the widow, the one who had orchestrated everything. The widow had been nothing more than a pawn in his game, a tool to further his own power. And now, with her husband out of the way, she had become an even more dangerous player in the organization's plans. Father Brown's mind raced as he pieced everything together. The businessman had been caught in the web of lies, but he had been trying to break free. He had been in contact with people who had been investigating the organization, and he had planned to expose them. But the widow had been prepared for this. She had killed her husband to protect herself and the organization. But the more Father Brown uncovered, the more he realized that the widow wasn't the only one involved. There was a larger conspiracy at play, one that stretched beyond just her and her late husband. As Father Brown continued to dig, he found more and more connections between the widow and other powerful figures, people who had been involved in illegal dealings, people who had been part of the organization's secret network. The deeper Father Brown went, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a simple murder. It was about power, greed, and control. The widow had been part of something far bigger than herself, and now the investigation was opening up a dark, dangerous world that no one had ever suspected. Just when Father Brown thought he had uncovered all the pieces, something even more unsettling happened. A new suspect entered the picture. It wasn't a person he had been watching closely before, but as the pieces fell into place, it became clear that this new suspect was connected to the conspiracy in ways Father Brown hadn't imagined. The more he learned about this individual, the more he began to question everything he thought he knew. Could this person have been the real mastermind behind the murder? Had the widow been manipulated, just like her late husband? Or had she been an active participant in the darker schemes of the organization? Father Brown's investigation had always seemed like a puzzle with missing pieces, but now it was clear that the entire puzzle was shifting. The pieces didn't fit the way he thought they did, and the deeper he dug, the more convoluted the mystery became. The widow's lies were no longer the main focus. They were just the surface. The truth was darker, deeper, and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The conspiracy that Father Brown had uncovered reached far beyond what he had expected, and now every decision he made felt like it would tip the scales of a much larger game. He had come too far to turn back, but the more he learned, the more he realized that the truth might be something that no one could handle. And then, as if to add fuel to the fire, Father Brown received a visit. A shadowy figure, someone whose face he couldn't quite make out, appeared at his door. The figure didn't speak at first. They simply handed him an envelope, its contents unknown, and left without a word. Inside the envelope, Father Brown found something that made his blood run cold. A photograph of the widow, taken from a distance, alongside someone he didn't recognize. A man, tall and imposing, whose face seemed eerily familiar. Father Brown's heart skipped a beat as he realized who the man was. It was Edmund Cole. The figure in the photo was standing close to the widow, a picture that seemed to suggest a much deeper connection between them than Father Brown had originally believed. But there was more. Written on the back of the photo, in a hurried, scribbled hand, were the words, "She's lying." All of it. The message was clear. Father Brown had uncovered a deadly truth, but there were still so many questions left unanswered. The widow had been lying. But about what? And how deep did the conspiracy go? Every piece of evidence Father Brown had uncovered only raised more questions, and the more he learned, the more dangerous the case became. Father Brown was no longer sure who he could trust. The widow's deceit had been uncovered, but now there was an even darker truth lurking beneath the surface. Who else was involved, and what would happen if Father Brown exposed it all? The stakes had never been higher, and the truth, it seemed, was something no one was prepared for. The tension was unbearable. Father Brown knew the final confrontation was coming, but with every step closer to the truth, the danger grew. He had uncovered a sinister secret, one that could change everything. But the question remained, was he ready to face the consequences of exposing it? "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, but the weight of the truth was too much to bear. But the truth will never be told. And as Father Brown stood there, contemplating the next move, he knew that the mystery was far from over. The widow's deceit had led him to a new, darker revelation. But what came next could shatter everything. The stakes had never been higher. The game was far from finished. Chapter 9. Father Brown solves a deadly riddle. The last piece of the puzzle slid into place, and with it came the terrifying realization that the case Father Brown had been chasing was no longer just a murder. It was a meticulously crafted riddle, designed to mislead and confuse. The widow, once a figure of innocent grief, now stood exposed as the mastermind behind a plot that had only just begun to unfold. The truth had always been right in front of him, disguised in riddles, hidden in plain sight. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle aligned, the horrific truth was more terrifying than anything Father Brown could have imagined. And with this revelation, he realized that no one was truly safe. Not the widow, not the victim, and certainly not him. Father Brown had spent weeks carefully piecing together the clues, each one seeming to lead him in circles, every answer coming with more questions. The widow's story had been a web of lies from the start. But as Father Brown dug deeper, he uncovered something far more sinister than just a simple case of murder. She had been hiding the truth behind a series of intricate riddles that had been left behind, deliberately placed in the path of anyone trying to solve the mystery. It had been a game, one that she had been playing all along, and Father Brown had unknowingly been a part of it. The mystery started innocently enough: a businessman's death, a grieving widow, and the usual questions about motives and alibis. But as Father Brown unraveled the web of deceit, he realized that there was something more, something deeper at play. The widow's actions, her every word, had been carefully calculated, like the moves of a master chess player. The riddles she left behind were designed to keep him in the dark, to keep him chasing after false leads, never quite able to grasp the full picture. Each riddle was a step in a carefully planned strategy, one that led Father Brown closer to the truth, but only after he had been misdirected and manipulated at every turn. But now, the truth was finally within his grasp. The widow, with all her lies and manipulation, was not the innocent victim she had portrayed herself to be. She had orchestrated her husband's death, not out of grief, but out of necessity. He had been a pawn, a means to an end, and when he had outlived his usefulness, she had made sure he was removed from the equation. But what was the reason behind it all? What had she been trying to accomplish? The answers were hidden in the riddles she had carefully constructed, and Father Brown had finally deciphered them. The widow's true role in the crime was far more complex than anyone had realized. She hadn't just been involved in her husband's murder, she had orchestrated it. She had known exactly what she was doing when she manipulated the situation. And now, with everything finally coming to light, Father Brown was left to confront the terrifying implications of what she had done. The clues had always been there, buried beneath layers of lies and deceit, but they had been so carefully crafted that they had remained hidden until now. The widow had used every trick in the book to cover her tracks, but Father Brown had finally cracked the code. As Father Brown pieced together the last of the riddles, he uncovered something even more disturbing: a new suspect, someone who had been lurking in the shadows all along. This person had been involved in the plot from the very beginning, and their role in the crime was more sinister than Father Brown had imagined. Who was this new suspect, and how were they connected to the widow and the businessman's death? The mystery had taken another dark turn, and Father Brown was no closer to uncovering the full truth than he had been before. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more he realized that the web of deceit stretched far beyond the widow and her husband. There were others involved, powerful figures who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The widow was just a puppet, a small piece in a much larger conspiracy. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The truth was no longer just a matter of solving a murder. It was about exposing a conspiracy that could bring down everyone involved. And the closer Father Brown got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. With every new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Father Brown had always prided himself on his ability to solve the most complex of mysteries, but this case was different. It was more than just a murder. It was a game of manipulation, a battle of wits between Father Brown and the widow, one that could only end in disaster. The riddles had been a trap, carefully designed to keep him off balance, to force him into making mistakes. And as Father Brown pieced together the final clues, he realized that the final riddle was the most dangerous of all. The widow had known all along that Father Brown would eventually uncover the truth. She had been counting on it, but she had underestimated him. Father Brown had seen through her lies, had deciphered the riddles she had left behind. And now, as he faced her for the final time, he knew that the game was over. The truth was out. But as he prepared to confront her with what he had uncovered, he couldn't shake the feeling that the widow was still holding something back, something even more dangerous than he could imagine. "I know what you've done," Father Brown said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the truth. "I know what you've been hiding, and I know who's behind this. But the question is, do you? Do you know who you're dealing with?" The widow's face remained expressionless, but Father Brown could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She had thought she had won. She had thought she could control the situation. But now, with the truth out in the open, it was clear that she had underestimated the power of Father Brown's determination. But just as Father Brown was about to deliver the final blow, something happened that stopped him in his tracks. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man Father Brown had never seen before. His face was cold, calculating, and as he stepped into the room, Father Brown knew instantly that he was no ordinary man. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the one Father Brown had been missing all along. The true mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. The man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Father Brown. "You're getting too close, Father," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Father Brown felt a chill run down his spine. He had uncovered the widow's deceit, but now, it seemed, he had uncovered something far darker, a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power, and the man standing before him was the one pulling the strings. "You've made a grave mistake, Father," the man continued, his smile twisted and cruel. "You think you've solved the riddle, but you've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to this than you could ever understand." Father Brown stood there, frozen, as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had come so far, uncovered so many secrets, but now, standing before this new enemy, he realized that the truth was still far from within reach. The widow had been just one part of the puzzle, and the man before him was the final, terrifying piece. Father Brown had solved the riddle, but in doing so, he had uncovered something much darker. The stakes were higher than ever, and now, more than ever, Father Brown was unsure who he could trust. As the man's words hung in the air, Father Brown felt a deep sense of unease. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore, it was about survival. And the final chapter of this mystery was about to unfold. "I know who did it," Father Brown whispered, his voice low, "but the truth will never be told." And with that, the room fell silent. As the realization hit Father Brown, this was far from over. Chapter 10. The widow's secret almost kills Father Brown. Father Brown had just narrowly escaped death. The sharp, metallic scent of blood clung to his nostrils as he staggered back, his heart pounding with a mixture of shock and adrenaline. 1 second, he had been investigating the final, deadliest secret of the widow's past, and the next, he found himself face to face with a killer who had no intention of letting him live to tell the tale. His escape had been nothing short of a miracle, but what he uncovered in those final moments before his life was nearly taken was something so horrifying, so utterly shocking, that it would change the course of the investigation and his life forever. The investigation had led Father Brown down a winding, treacherous path. The widow, once thought to be an innocent victim, caught in the tragic murder of her husband, had proven to be a master of manipulation, hiding a web of lies and deceit that spanned far beyond the murder. The more Father Brown uncovered, the deeper the conspiracy seemed to grow until he could no longer see where the truth ended and the lies began. Every turn brought more questions, and every answer seemed to reveal a new layer of danger. But nothing had prepared Father Brown for what was about to happen. The widow's dark secret, one that had been buried for years, was finally within his grasp. He had pieced together the final clues, the ones that had eluded him for so long. But as Father Brown approached the truth, someone, or something, tried to stop him from uncovering it. Someone who would go to any length to keep the widow's secret hidden. The mysterious figure who had been lurking in the shadows for so long had made their move, and now Father Brown was at the center of a deadly game, a game where the stakes were no longer just the truth, but his very life. It started with a phone call. A voice on the other end, cold and threatening, had warned Father Brown to stop digging. The message had been clear. If you want to live, stay out of it. But Father Brown had never been one to back down from a mystery, especially not one as dangerous as this. The warning had only fueled his determination, and he pressed on, determined to expose the widow for the liar she truly was. He had traced the final pieces of evidence back to a meeting place, a hidden location where the widow had once made a deal with the very people who had been controlling her from the shadows. She had made a pact with dangerous individuals, people whose power and reach extended far beyond anything Father Brown had ever encountered. This was no longer just a murder investigation. This was a conspiracy, a web of lies and violence that had ensnared everyone involved. Father Brown had been careful, methodical, but he had been too trusting. He thought he could uncover the truth without consequences. But now, as he stepped into the dark alleyway, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He had known this moment would come, the moment when someone would try to stop him. But he hadn't expected it to be this close, this immediate. His mind raced as he looked around the shadowy alley, trying to sense any movement, any hint of danger. The dim light from a street lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the cobblestones. The air was thick with tension, and Father Brown's instincts told him something was wrong. He had been followed. He wasn't alone. And then, as if on cue, a figure stepped out of the darkness. The figure was tall, their features obscured by the night, but Father Brown knew instantly that this wasn't just some random bystander. This was the one who had been watching him, the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Before he could react, the figure lunged toward him, a sharp blade glinting in the dim light. Father Brown barely had time to react, his heart racing as he sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the deadly strike. But the attacker was fast, relentless. Another blow came, this time grazing his shoulder. The pain was immediate, sharp, but Father Brown had no time to dwell on it. He had to survive, had to escape. He moved quickly, using his wits to outmaneuver the attacker, dodging into an alleyway, his heart pounding as he ran. The chase was on. The footsteps behind him grew louder, more insistent. Father Brown's mind raced as he looked for an escape route, but the alley was narrow, the buildings towering above him, offering little cover. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed his body to its limits, but the attacker was closing in, gaining on him. The figure was relentless, and Father Brown realized with a sickening feeling that they weren't just after him. They were after something more. They were after the truth Father Brown had been so close to uncovering. Just as Father Brown thought he might be cornered, he made a sharp turn down another alley. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to stop the attacker, but there was no time. The alley opened up ahead, leading to a street filled with people. He could escape. He had to. But just as he reached the end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. It was the widow. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and Father Brown's heart sank. She had known he was getting too close, and now she had come to finish what had been started. The figure who had attacked him had been working for her, a hired hand. But the real danger had always been her. She had orchestrated everything, pulling strings from the shadows, making sure that no one could ever uncover her secrets. Father Brown stood frozen, caught between the widow and the figure who had been stalking him. The truth was within his grasp, but now it seemed like he would never be able to escape the web she had spun. The widow smiled, a thin, cold smile that sent a chill down Father Brown's spine. "You've come too far, Father," she said, her voice dripping with menace. "You should have stopped when you had the chance. But now, you're going to pay the price for your curiosity." Father Brown's mind raced as he realized the full scope of the widow's betrayal. She hadn't just manipulated her husband's death. She had been playing a much darker game, one that would destroy everyone who got too close. But what was the ultimate goal? What was she trying to achieve? The more Father Brown thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about her husband's murder. It was about power, control, and a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything Father Brown had ever anticipated. Just as the widow's henchman raised the blade once more, a sudden noise from behind startled them both. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and imposing, their face obscured. The figure raised a weapon, not at Father Brown, but at the widow's henchman, striking him down in a single, powerful blow. Father Brown stood there, stunned, as the man fell to the ground, unconscious. The figure stepped forward, and Father Brown's eyes widened as he realized who it was. It was the businessman, alive. The widow's face turned white as she stared at the man who had supposedly been dead. You were supposed to be gone. You weren't supposed to be here." Her voice trembled, a crack of fear seeping through her carefully constructed facade. The businessman, or what was left of him, was a shadow of his former self. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he stood there, staring down the widow with a look of cold fury. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? You thought you could manipulate everyone, even me." His voice was low, filled with anger and betrayal. "But you didn't count on me surviving." Father Brown's heart pounded as the truth began to sink in. The widow's role in the murder had been much more than just a passive act. She had been manipulating the businessman all along, working with people who were even more dangerous than she was. But now, with the businessman back, with everything on the line, Father Brown realized that the real game was only just beginning. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice steady despite the shock that still gripped him. "But the truth—" He paused, his gaze flicking between the widow and the businessman. "The truth will never be told." And with that, the room fell silent, as the weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. What would happen now? Would the widow be brought to justice? Or would the dark forces she had been hiding for so long come crashing down on everyone? The mystery was far from over, and the truth was still slipping away. But one thing was clear: the final deadly secret of the widow had been uncovered, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 11: Father Brown, Unraveling a Deadly Plot. The revelation came in a whisper, as chilling as the cold wind that swept through the narrow alley where Father Brown stood. "You've only just begun to understand the danger," the voice said, low and ominous. "But if you keep going, you'll destroy everything. Not just your life, Father, but the lives of everyone around you." It was a warning, but it only served to ignite the fire within Father Brown. The stakes had never been higher. The mystery that had seemed like a simple case of murder had transformed into something far more dangerous, something that threatened not only his life, but the lives of everyone he held dear. Father Brown was no stranger to danger, but the deeper he delved into the widow's life, the more he realized he was up against something far darker than he had imagined. The lies, the manipulation, and the web of deceit she had spun were only the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. And as he stood there, staring at the shadowy figure in the alley, a realization hit him hard. This was no longer just about solving a murder. This was about uncovering a plot so deadly, so far-reaching, that even Father Brown's resolve began to waver. He had already uncovered secrets, exposed lies, but this was something far beyond his control. The widow's role had been clear. She was the puppet master, orchestrating events from the shadows. But Father Brown's investigation had revealed more than just her involvement in her husband's death. There were others, hidden forces, powerful people, working behind the scenes, pulling strings and controlling lives from the darkness. The deeper Father Brown dug, the more he realized the murder was just the beginning. Someone had wanted the businessman dead. But why? And who had been pulling the strings? The closer he came to the answers, the more dangerous the web seemed to become. Father Brown had always believed that the truth was the most important thing. But what if uncovering that truth led to destruction? What if it meant putting everyone he loved in danger? He had always seen himself as a man of faith, someone who sought justice and truth. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he was starting to question whether exposing the conspiracy would be worth the cost. The weight of what he was about to uncover threatened to crush him under its sheer magnitude. The widow was only one part of the puzzle, But she had been the key. She had manipulated everyone, including Father Brown. But now, with each new piece of evidence, Father Brown realized that there was more at play here than just a murder and a widow's lies. The conspiracy ran deep, stretching into the very heart of the city, affecting not just one life, but many. And it wasn't just about money or power, it was about control. Control of people, control of information, control of everything. The widow had been a pawn, but the true masterminds were much more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As Father Brown continued to investigate, the mystery became even more complicated. Each lead he followed seemed to twist back on itself, each clue leading to more questions than answers. The people he thought he could trust, the connections he thought were solid, all seemed to be tied to something much darker. There was a larger conspiracy at play, one that reached far beyond the widow's involvement in her husband's death. It was a system of power, manipulation, and control that had been built over decades, and now Father Brown had become a part of it. The more Father Brown uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. He wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. He was uncovering a criminal empire that had been hidden in plain sight, one that had infiltrated every level of society. The widow had been involved in something much larger than anyone had realized, but so had many others. The businessmen, the politicians, even some of the city's most respected figures, they were all part of the same network, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Father Brown's investigation had already cost him so much: his faith, his trust in the people around him, and even his safety had been shaken. But he couldn't stop now. The truth was within his reach, and he couldn't let fear or doubt stand in his way. Every moment he hesitated, every moment he let the shadows close in around him, brought the conspiracy one step closer to victory. And the truth was dangerous. It would expose the darkest corners of society, tear down everything that had been built on lies and manipulation. It was a truth that had the power to destroy everything. But as Father Brown pieced together the final clues, a new question arose. Who was behind it all? The widow had been a key figure, but she was just a small part of a much larger operation. There was someone else, someone who had orchestrated the entire plot, someone who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. But who? And what was their ultimate goal? Was it just about power and money? Or was there something more sinister at play? The closer Father Brown got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. He had already uncovered so much, but there was one last piece of the puzzle, one last clue that could bring it all together. But as he dug deeper, he realized that the more he uncovered, the more he risked. The conspiracy wasn't just a threat to the widow's life, it was a threat to everyone. The people involved in this plot weren't just criminals. They were powerful, untouchable, and willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. Father Brown found himself at a crossroads. The truth was closer than ever, but it was a dangerous truth. Could he expose it without putting his own life and the lives of those he cared about at risk? Could he risk everything to bring down the conspiracy, knowing that it could destroy everything in its path? The stakes were higher than ever, and Father Brown knew that he had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and every moment brought him closer to the truth and closer to danger. As Father Brown moved forward with his investigation, he knew that the conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect itself. They would do anything to keep their secrets buried, and Father Brown was now a threat to everything they had built. He was no longer just a detective. He was a target, And as he uncovered more about the people involved, he realized that even the most trusted figures in society were not above suspicion. No one was safe. Then came the revelation that would change everything. A new suspect, one Father Brown had never even considered, entered the picture. It wasn't a person he had been watching, nor someone he had suspected in the beginning. But as he pieced together the final bits of evidence, it became clear that this person was more involved than anyone had realized. They had been part of the plot from the very beginning, and their involvement was deeper than Father Brown had imagined. This was the missing link, the final piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. Father Brown felt the weight of the discovery pressed down on him. It was too much. The truth was no longer just a matter of solving a murder. It was about stopping a conspiracy that could destroy everything. But Father Brown had no choice. He had come this far, and he couldn't stop now. He had to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. With the final piece in place, Father Brown stood on the brink of the greatest revelation of his career. The conspiracy had been exposed. The mastermind had been revealed. But now, more than ever, Father Brown was faced with a question that would haunt him forever. Was the truth worth the cost? Was he willing to sacrifice everything to stop the plot, even if it meant risking his life and the lives of those he loved? "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the situation. "But the truth?" He paused, his eyes narrowing as he realized the full extent of what he had uncovered. "The truth will never be told." And with that, Father Brown stood at the crossroads, knowing that the final chapter of this deadly mystery had yet to be written. The conspiracy was exposed, but the consequences were still to come. And the game was far from over. Chapter 12. Father Brown faces a web of lies. The moment Father Brown walked into the room, the final truth hit him like a freight train. Everything he had thought he knew, every conclusion, every piece of evidence, every gut feeling, had been a lie. The widow, the mastermind he had been chasing for months, was standing before him, her face betraying not a flicker of fear, but a cold, calculating smile. And just when he thought the web of deceit had been completely unraveled, he realized there was still one last, devastating truth hidden beneath the lies. The widow had been playing a far more dangerous game than he had ever imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. Father Brown had followed the clues relentlessly, digging deeper into the widow's past, uncovering her lies, her manipulations, and the deadly web she had spun around the life of her late husband. He had exposed her connections to a powerful criminal organization, revealed the truth behind her husband's murder, and pieced together the complex motives that had driven her to destroy everything in her path. But now, as he stood there facing her, he realized that the full extent of her deception had yet to be revealed. The puzzle he had been trying to solve had been missing a key piece, a piece that would change everything. With the widow cornered, Father Brown believed he was moments away from the final revelation. The case had been twisted, complicated, and deeply dangerous, but he had reached a breaking point. He had the evidence, the confessions, and the motives laid out in front of him. He was about to expose her for the fraud, the liar, the murderer she truly was. And yet, as he spoke the words he thought would bring the case to an end, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You think you know everything, don't you, Father?" The widow's voice was eerily calm, almost soothing, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "You've been chasing shadows, looking for answers that have been right in front of you the entire time." Father Brown felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't the widow he had been investigating. This was someone entirely different, someone far more dangerous, who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. He stepped forward, holding up the last of the evidence he had uncovered. Documents, photographs, and a confession that had finally tied the widow to the murder. But before he could speak, the widow silenced him with a simple gesture. "It's over, Father," she said softly. "You've unraveled the mystery, but you've only scratched the surface of what's really going on. You think you've exposed the truth, but you have no idea what you've walked into." Father Brown's mind raced. He had uncovered the widow's deepest secrets, but now she was telling him something entirely different. He had thought he was close to the truth, but was he? Had he been led down a false trail all along? The questions surged in his mind, each one more urgent than the last. "I know what you've done," Father Brown replied, his voice steady, despite the growing unease gnawing at him. "I know about your involvement in your husband's murder. You thought you could hide your lies, but the truth has been exposed." The widow smiled, but it wasn't a smile of defeat. It was a smile of someone who had already won. "You don't understand, Father. You've solved the puzzle, but you haven't seen the full picture. You've been digging into a mystery that was never meant to be solved, and now the consequences of your pursuit are going to be far greater than you can imagine." Father Brown's heart pounded in his chest. He thought he understood what was happening, but now, with the widow's words ringing in his ears, he wasn't so sure. The case had been about more than just a murder. It had been about power, manipulation, and control. The widow had been a pawn in a much larger game, and Father Brown was just beginning to see the scope of the conspiracy that had been orchestrated from the shadows. But as he looked into her eyes, he could sense something else, a deeper, darker truth waiting to be revealed. The widow's role in the crime had been just one part of a much larger plot, and as Father Brown began to connect the dots, the full extent of the danger became clear. There were forces at play here that went far beyond the widow's lies. She was just a small piece of the puzzle. The true masterminds were people with far more power, people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Father Brown's suspicions grew stronger with each passing moment. The web of deceit stretched far beyond the widow's manipulation. There were others, hidden figures, powerful players, who had been controlling everything from behind the scenes. But who were they, and what was their ultimate goal? Father Brown knew he had to uncover the final piece of the puzzle, but the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The more Father Brown dug into the widow's past, the more secrets he uncovered. She hadn't just been a member of the criminal network, she had been one of its leaders. She had been using her marriage as a cover, manipulating her husband and the people around her to build a vast empire of corruption. But as Father Brown connected the final dots, he realized that the conspiracy went even deeper. It wasn't just about the widow's rise to power, it was about something far darker. Father Brown's mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle came together. The murder of the businessman, the lies, the manipulations, it had all been part of a much larger plan. The widow had been working with a powerful group of individuals, people who had orchestrated everything from the shadows. And now, with the truth finally within his grasp, Father Brown realized that he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The widow's smile faded as she stepped forward, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Father. You think you've solved this mystery, but you haven't even scratched the surface of what's really going on. The truth will destroy you and everyone you care about. Father Brown stood his ground. He had come too far to turn back now, but as he looked into the widow's eyes, he could see the truth. She had known everything all along. She had been playing him like a pawn in her game, leading him down a false trail, setting him up for the final blow. "You've been running from the truth for so long," Father Brown said, his voice firm, "but now it's time to face it. Your lies won't protect you anymore." But before he could take another step, the widow's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "You think you can expose me? You think you've won?" Her eyes glinted with a sinister light. "You're wrong, Father. The game has just begun." Father Brown's blood ran cold as he realized the full extent of what was happening. The widow wasn't just a murderer. She was part of something far more dangerous, something that reached into the highest levels of power. She wasn't the only one who had been manipulating events. There were others involved, people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And just as Father Brown was about to make his final move, a new figure emerged from the shadows. Someone Father Brown had never seen before, but whose presence sent a shiver down his spine. The figure stepped forward, their face obscured by a mask, but their eyes locked on Father Brown with cold, calculating intensity. "You're too late, Father," the figure said, their voice low and threatening. "The truth is already in motion, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Father Brown's mind raced as he tried to process the new development. Who was this new player? How were they connected to the widow and the conspiracy? The stakes had just been raised, and the truth was slipping further out of reach. "I know who did it," Father Brown said, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "But the truth—" He paused, looking at the widow and the masked figure. "The truth will never be told." And with that, Father Brown knew that the final chapter of this deadly game was just beginning. The mystery was far from over, and the consequences of the truth could destroy everything. But Father Brown had no choice. He had come too far to stop now. The web of lies was unraveling, but the dangers of uncovering the full truth were just beginning to take shape. And Father Brown could only wonder who would survive in the end.